new year is here, and with it comes a new handheld from Retroid with their successor to the Retroid Pocket 5. And with it comes some exciting new features and refinements from the prior generation. Retroid is taking a no-compromise approach to the 6, and for the first time ever will offer the handheld in either a D-pad top or stick top configuration, settling a long-debated topic in the retro handheld space. And with a new generation comes more power thanks to the tried and true Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, which has been seen for some time now in this space, as well as the return of the beautiful AMOLED display. The 6 is thoroughly retro, but as the saying goes, there's more than meets the eye. So please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we dive into the Retroid Pocket 6 and find out if 6 is the fix for your retro kicks. Let's quickly roll through the specs, price, and then take a tour around the Retroid Pocket 6, which as always comes in the very recognizable Retroid packaging, including the cardboard box that is lovingly adorned with the words "Made in China" on it. As I mentioned, Retroid returns with more power for the 6, using the very well-known Snapdragon 8 Gen 2 that was seen in the entirety of the Odin 2 lineup, as well as the Thor, and features 8 cores with up to 3.2 GHz and uses the Adreno 740 for graphics clocked up to 680 MHz. And we're going to do some light benchmarking in just a little bit. We do have the return of the same sized AMOLED display at 5.5 inches with a resolution of 1920 by 1080, but this time around the panel supports up to a 120Hz refresh rate, which is a welcome addition that can be utilized in many different ways. The AMOLED display was a highlight for the Retroid Pocket 5, and the same remains true here for the 6. And for the first time ever, Retroid is offering the 6 with 2 key options. The choice to have either the D-pad up top or go with the stick on top. And with that choice being made, both variations are available with either the 8GB or 16GB of LPDDR5X RAM, and likewise with either 128GB or 256GB of UFS 3.1 internal storage, with the ability to expand storage through the microSD slot. And the review unit I was sent is the model with the 8GB of RAM and 128GB of storage. The Retroid Pocket 6 will be available in 5 different color options, including black, 16-bit, silver, which is actually the color that I personally ordered, orange, and the color that I have on hand here, which is the light purple option. On board we have Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.3, a 3.5mm audio port, and a single USB 3.1 Type-C port for data, charging, and video out up to 4K at 60Hz. The Retroid Pocket 6 ships with Android 13 out of the box and features a 6000 mAh battery that supports 27-watt charging. And as always, we will take a deeper look at battery performance towards the end of this video. Inside the package for the Pocket 6, it's a pretty standard fare for a Retroid Pocket, and we have the usual spec sheet and a USB Type-C to C cable. The Retroid Pocket 6 is available for purchase off the official Retroid website or from their official AliExpress store. They are now taking pre-orders for the second batch of shipment, which is currently planned for a March 2026 ship date. The 8GB and 128GB configuration starts at $229 plus shipping, and then $279 for the 12GB and 256GB model. And I do think the $50 is worth the extra RAM and double the internal storage, which is the unit that I purchased. I'd also like to thank Retroid for providing this review unit so that I can get this in-depth coverage out for my audience. And as always, this video was not reviewed prior to publishing. So let's take a tour around the Retroid Pocket 6 and get familiar with the handheld and check out some of the changes that have been made from the prior generation. As always, starting out at the top right, we've got the return of the stacked shoulder button and Hall effect trigger. Both the shoulder button and triggers are actually larger than what we saw with the Retroid Pocket 5 and G2. The shoulder button does have a very similar action as the one found on the Retroid Pocket 5, but I think this is a little bit quieter, and it does have a subtle clickiness to it. I do like, as always, that the button can be pressed down on any point, and as I mentioned, because it is larger, it actually makes it a bit more comfortable to press down on, since I can easily press it from a much wider point, and the way I grip my hands around the Pocket 6 really makes this quite noticeable compared to the 5. The same goes for the trigger, which is not only larger, but the range feels better because of the difference in size. The motion is nice and smooth and feels really solid. Now, for whatever reason, Retroid opted to not include any kind of texturing on the shoulder button or trigger, which is a bit of a bummer and surprising since they've been doing this since the Pocket 4. Now, moving across the device at the top, we have our host of buttons for power and volume up and down. And moving along to the left side, of course, we have the left shoulder button and trigger, but now we can get a glimpse of the improved ergonomics with the 6. Which does have a slightly larger grip, and this alone does make the Pocket 6 much more comfortable to hold in the hands. At the bottom, we have the micro SD slot for storage expansion, and both the door and the mechanism for loading the micro SD card work as expected. To the right of that, we have the 3.5mm audio port, and then at the center, the USB Type-C port for data charging and video out. On the back side, we've got our usual host of exhaust vents and a smaller than expected intake for the active cooling built in. The exhaust vents look to use a different material, which does give it a bit of character to an otherwise pretty uninteresting aspect of a handheld. I do like the design pattern and the minimal Retroid branding. And we do have the addition of rear programmable buttons, and they are a little bit awkward to reach, but I think for those that like having this feature, it's better than not at all. Much like the shoulder buttons and triggers, Retroid omitted the texturing on the grip like we saw with the 5, and while it's nice having that slightly extra grippiness, I'm not finding it to be something that I'm actually missing with the 6. Again, the grips are bigger than before, and it really helps the device out in terms of comfort, as is without any additional accessories. I find that I can rest the full length of my fingers around the grip, which really makes it feel solid in my hands. The 6's grips are about 26.5mm at the thickest point, whereas the 5's grips are about 22.5mm, and so that extra 4mm of thickness makes quite the difference. I can definitely say that out of every generation, the 6 is the most comfortable device that Retroid has made out of the box. On the front side, of course, is where all the magic happens, and it gives us an opportunity to talk about the controls, and starting out with the option to now go with either an analog stick at the top, like on this unit, or to opt for the D-pad on top, which I actually did for the retail unit that I purchased. The analog stick is the same as we've seen on prior Retroid devices, using the same Jinful style sticks with the better range and movement than just the standard Switch style ones that we've seen from way back. The joystick caps have the texturing around them, but this time we've got slightly more convex style as opposed to the more concave sticks on the 5, G2, and some of the others. They're very similar to the ones that are found on the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. And the D-pad is your typical Retroid-style D-pad that we've seen on countless devices now, including AYN handhelds. This Vita-inspired D-pad, which uses dome switches, is easily one of my favorites on a handheld device. And I have to say, I really appreciate the beautiful crystal-style D-pad that Retroid opted for here, which I don't find my fingers slipping off of, and again, it just has really nice movement with a pretty good pivot in the center. It makes rolling the D-pad an absolute joy, and pulling off combos in something like Marvel vs. Capcom 2 a breeze, even for someone as terrible as myself. And speaking of the crystal style D-pad, Retroid opted to do the same style for the face buttons here, which are quite beautiful in design and in person. I know it might seem silly to focus so intently on this, but this process is more costly and complicated than just your typical face button, since it uses the double shot injection molding technique to create this effect, and does make the device feel a lot more premium. The face buttons are membrane based and also surprisingly very quiet, especially compared to Retroid's prior devices, and I'm honestly shocked at how quiet they are, and it was definitely one of the things that immediately stood out to me. But most importantly, the face buttons feel good. They press down well with just the right amount of travel. And again, I think it goes without saying that this might be their best yet. In addition to all this, we've got our start and select, as well as dedicated buttons for Android navigation, which all use dome switches. Now, we can't forget about our front firing speakers, and while these aren't going to blow anyone away with its audio quality, they do get quite loud at the top end. I find that the volume scaling can be improved, since 50% volume is really quiet to me, and so it's something I'd like to see Retroid scale a bit differently. The speakers, including the grille, look identical to the ones found on the Retroid Pocket 5 and G2, and I'll actually be curious to see what's inside during the teardown. One other thing worth mentioning here is that part of the speakers will be obstructed when holding it with your thumbs placed up high on the left and on the right. Finally, there's the return of the beautiful AMOLED display and the same 5.5-inch size with the 1920 by 1080 resolution, but this time around we do get an improvement with the ability to hit 120Hz refresh rate. The AMOLED display, at least to my aging eyes, looks great. I didn't notice any obvious PWM flickering, which can be picked up sometimes on my camera when a device really has the issue like the Anbernic RG557. And it does seem to have a very minimal amount at or under 30%. Now, I can't comment on this too much since it doesn't impact me personally, but I figured it was worth mentioning. Again, this is a great looking display and all the games I've tested here look fantastic with a solid brightness up to 550 nits. I know that some viewers have been curious about how the comfort is with the D-pad being placed on the bottom now, and mainly for those D-pad centric games, and surprisingly, to me, it's pretty comfortable. Again, those grips on the back make it a bit easier to hold the device with some authority, and so for example, I can have a nice solid grip on that right side that allows me to maneuver my hand as needed on the left. I would have liked to have seen the lower inputs like the D-pad on this unit and the right analog stick be a bit further inset, since there is some room for that, and depending on how you're holding the Pocket 6, it might have helped a little bit given the natural placement of your thumb. Now overall, the Retroid Pocket 6 feels like a nicely put together handheld that feels really good in the hands, and it's remarkable just how subtle changes to design can make quite a big difference in the way a product feels and functions. The comfort alone is a much welcome improvement, and a noticeable one at that. It's very obvious to me that with each generation, Retroid goes back and learns something new, and with that, how to improve on their handhelds. And the 6 very much demonstrates that. So let's now check out what Retroid has done under the hood, and tear this all apart. As always, one of the key goals for the teardown section is to gain access to the battery and see the steps required for that process, as well as examine a few other things like checking out the face buttons and maybe having some fun with that. If teardowns are not your thing, please feel free to skip ahead and use the timestamps below. As always, I have my trusty iFixit to get things going here, and the Retroid Pocket 6 has 4 visible Phillips screws on the back. I'll go ahead and use a size 00 bit for this, which does seem to work quite well. And let's quickly get these removed and then focus on popping off this back cover. The back cover is pretty dang secure, so let's first use something like this pick here to create some separation between the seams which we can't see all around the device. I typically like to start out at the shoulder trigger as a way to get some leverage and then put enough pressure so that I can get that pick in there and then start separating the tabs, kind of like what I'm doing here on screen. And then with that, we can slide the pick across and then separate all the tabs at the top. Now for the rest of the back cover, I'm actually just going to pry it off by hand since I think I've got enough loose at the top to do it this way. It is very secure, so you will need to give it a bit of force, but the good thing is that there is nothing connected to the backplate, so you are safe there. With that, we can take a look at the back piece, and of course we see the exhaust vents and the intake with the screen on it to prevent any dust and debris from going in. I actually kind of want to test the resistance of the color on the plastic, and so I'll do my best Jerry Rigs Everything impersonation and just scratch the heck out of the plastic with my flathead here. The plastic holds up quite well, and it does seem like we shouldn't experience any issues with the color fading on the opposite side, which is definitely awesome. I also want to quickly mention just how surprisingly beautiful this device looks internally. It's much appreciated, even if it's never seen. So let's work on gaining access to the face buttons, which will let us take a look at a few things like how they are keyed, as well as swapping from the Nintendo to Xbox style layout, and maybe even a swap with another handheld for fun. The nice thing about going through this is I can actually guide everyone to go in the correct order. I originally removed the bottom piece here, which isn't the ideal way to do this, since the cable for the analog stick is buried under the top piece. So let's just pretend I haven't removed the bottom plastic piece, and so we will start with the top plastic piece. The shoulder trigger is slightly in the way of the screws here, so I recommend popping off the cap for the trigger, which we can do with something like this spudger here, and with a little force, it should just pop right off and allow us full access to the screws. This shoulder trigger cap is its own thing, and again, it is not sized the same as either the RP5, G2, or even devices like the Odin 3 and Odin 2. Also, as a little trick, if you press down on the shoulder trigger before removing the screw, it makes it a little easier so you don't have to deal with that pesky magnet that can get in the way sometimes. So we've got 4 screws that need to be removed here. Let's go ahead and get those out quickly, and then we can continue using the same size bit for all of the internal screws. Make sure to keep track of your screws as they are different sizes. Okay, now we have part of the daughter board revealed, and you can see why I recommend removing this piece first, since there is a connection for the analog stick. And so let's pop up the tab and prepare to remove the bottom piece by taking out the 3 screws holding it in place. And since I did that already, bada bing bada boom, it's all done. With that piece out of the way, we now have full access to the daughter board. There are 2 connections that need to be disconnected, but we should at least lift the tabs up, and when we remove the 3 screws that are holding this board in place, we can gently lift the board out and the cables will disconnect all in one shot to make it nice and easy. And just like that, the board is out and now we have full access to the face buttons. And as I suspected, the buttons are glued down much like we've seen in past Retroid and AYN devices. The nice thing is the face buttons are easy to separate from the membrane. I also want to take a moment and just appreciate how beautifully finished these buttons are. Again, this clear effect is really cool and of course reminiscent of the beloved PSP and Vita. The Odin 2 Mini had a similar effect for its face buttons, but those are smaller than the ones we actually get here. In fact, the Retroid Pocket 6 face buttons are the same size as the ones found on the Odin 3 and the Thor, and if you know me by now, you already know that I will be swapping buttons between them, for science of course. But first, let's go ahead and do a layout swap, and as has been the case in the past, it does require snipping off some tabs and even a portion of the button to make this work. So on screen, I have a screenshot of exactly where you need to make those cuts. In order to make it work, you will need to separate the buttons from the membrane. You can do this pretty easily, and I personally used a pick and just found a spot where the glue wasn't present inside the button, and then used the pick as a way to separate the glue. Anyways, as you go through and remove the buttons from the membrane and work on snipping off the small pieces to make the keying work, just go slow, double check before cutting anything. It's better to go slow and avoid any mistakes. As you can see from the keying, some of the buttons not only have the small tabs to worry about, but some have a flat edge that makes it fit inside the space. So for this, I actually recommend putting the button into the space and then using a Sharpie to mark where you need to make that flat cut. It makes it a lot easier to not only remember where it needs to be done, but also give yourself a good idea of the kind of cut to make. Okay, with all of that, let's place all the buttons back in, and there you go. I've got my Xbox layout, and I'm gonna probably keep it this way for right now. One last thing, while we're talking about face buttons, let's go ahead and grab my set from the Odin 3, and as I suspected, the buttons are the same. The only difference here is that the membrane is larger for the Odin 3, but you can always save the one from the Retroid Pocket 6 and then use the buttons from an Odin 3 or a Thor if you desire. Oh yeah, by the way, if you follow me on Discord or maybe saw my YouTube post, I did take the beautiful crystal purple buttons and placed it in the Odin 3, and I have to say I'm kinda digging this color combination. I hope that Retroid will consider selling buttons and whatnot in the future on their website. Okay, let's get back to business now, and I figure the next thing we can do here is examine the steps required to get to the battery. It does look like the battery connection is hidden under the plastic piece here, so we will need to do some disassembly in the event that you wanted to reach the connection to remove the battery for servicing. I'm going to make an assumption here and say that the plastic piece around the fan is most likely the one that will need to be removed in order to gain access to the battery, and so we will skip over the 2 plastic pieces that are above and below the battery. So let's work on disconnecting the cables, and we have at least 3 connections to worry about, so let's quickly and of course carefully disconnect everything here. The plastic piece itself is held into place with 4 Phillips screws, but I do think the screws for the fan assembly are part of this as well, so I'm going to say that there are 6 screws that need to be removed here in total to get the entirety of this out. With all 6 screws removed, the fan itself will be loose, but it is taped down to part of the heatsink, so gently lift the fan out so that you can save this piece of tape and reuse it as needed. The fan is also connected to the mainboard, and this connection is hidden under the plastic piece, so carefully lift the piece up and disconnect the fan cable, and now everything should lift out. Okay, so this is something that I'm not crazy about, which is the battery connection being placed under the heatsink, which means that you have to go further to disconnect the battery from the Pocket 6. There's also a nice little Retroid sticker over one of the screws, which actually isn't enforceable, at least in the United States, so that sticker is meaningless, and because I'm a rebel, we're gonna go ahead and remove it and then remove the 4 Phillips screws holding the heatsink in place. My sticker was actually barely on, so I'm gonna put this aside and then put it back on when I'm done here. With the 4 screws removed, the heatsink lifts right up, and you can see the thermal pads being used here, and I'm actually going to leave this alone because we will find out in just a moment that the thermals are really good with the Pocket 6. so it doesn't need any help in this department. But what this means now is we finally have access to the battery connection, and now it can be serviced if you ever needed to do that. Alright, one last thing to examine in all of this chaos is the opposite side of the handheld, and just so we can quickly take a look at gaining access to the D-pad and the analog stick. I suspect it will be much of the same as what we did for the face buttons. Now, I guess with my old age, I'm suffering from short-term memory loss, and I completely forgot about the analog stick connection that goes into the other plastic piece like we saw earlier. So, of course, I started working on removing the screws from the plastic piece protecting the analog stick. Don't do this. Instead, focus on the D-pad's plastic piece because we want to at least lift the tab so the analog stick can be properly removed. Depending on your device, it might be opposite of what you are seeing here since I do have a joystick on top version. There are 3 screws that hold the plastic piece for the D-pad portion, and then like we saw on the opposite side, there are 4 screws holding the plastic piece for the analog stick. You can pop off the shoulder trigger like I showed earlier to make it easier to get to those screws. With all of those screws removed, we can remove both plastic pieces and also safely remove the analog stick assembly. Here's where things get a bit interesting. There are 2 connections that run from this daughter board to the main board, but it does look like they are obstructed by the plastic cover that is in place over the main board, which I have already removed here. Now more on this in a moment. Let's focus on getting the screws out of the daughter board here, which is held into place with 3 additional screws. Also make sure to lift the tab for the shoulder button connection at the top. So we can see now that with the screws removed, in order to fully free the daughter board from the shell and gain unobstructed access to the D-pad, we would also have to remove the center plastic piece, since one of the connections cannot be disconnected directly on the board itself. Okay, let's pop this D-pad out of the Pocket 6 and now we can admire its beauty. This D-pad is the same size as essentially all of the prior D-pads we have seen on both Retroid and AYM products, so in theory the D-pad is probably the most interchangeable component here. Alright, I'm worn out and tired of taking things apart, so let's put this all back together and do the next best thing. Run some numbers. Again, if this bores you, please use the timestamps below, but we're going to go through this as fast as possible since the 8 Gen 2 is a very well-known quantity in the retro handheld space, and I've been covering here on the channel for a long time in many devices, so any of those older videos could be used as a reference. The first thing I like to do is compare the performance profiles and see how they compare, and with the Retroid Pocket 6 as usual, we have standard, performance, and high performance. And we can see that in the Geekbench 6 test, the numbers are all very close here between the profiles. The same holds true for the 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme benchmark, and pretty close overall even in the Antutu benchmark. Honestly, I spent most of my playtime ignoring the high performance setting since I didn't find it did anything meaningful in real world performance. Now maybe you are unfamiliar with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, and so let's quickly look at what kind of jump you can expect in performance coming from the prior generation with the Retroid Pocket 5 and the Snapdragon 865. I also included the Odin 3 in the conversation since it's basically the best you can get in terms of raw power in an Android-based handheld device, as well as the recently released Retroid Pocket G2, which offers solid performance for the price, but it's kind of in a weird position within the Retroid lineup. But regardless, it's still worth featuring here. And no doubt about it, the Retroid Pocket 6 offers a very nice bump up in performance over its predecessor, the Retroid Pocket 5 and the Snapdragon 865, which can be seen in the various tests, including Geekbench 6, and then with the Wildlife Extreme benchmark, which saw a very impressive GPU bump over the Retroid Pocket 5, resulting in a whopping 180% increase. Finally, the same performance increase is seen in the Antutu suite as well, resulting in as much as a 58% increase in overall scores from the Retroid Pocket 5. It also goes without saying that the Odin 3 is substantially outpacing all of these devices, including the Retroid Pocket 6 in terms of its synthetic numbers. And I do have to give props to the Snapdragon G2 Gen 2 that is found in the Retroid Pocket G2, which does keep up here, and again, I'd love to see Retroid restructure pricing a little bit to give it some separation from the Retroid Pocket 6, since it's a strong performer for the price. Now, one last benchmark that I actually started doing, thanks to the Odin 3, is an actual in-game benchmark with a PC game, since we are now at the point where we can reliably do this with a lot of handhelds. So for this, I'm using Tomb Raider 2013, and again, just comparing what you could possibly expect coming from the Snapdragon 865 and something like the Retroid Pocket 5. And yes, I've included the Odin 3 again to demonstrate where the Retroid Pocket 6 lands in terms of performance. As much as I think that the Snapdragon 865 punches above its weight considering its age, the 8 Gen 2 essentially doubles performance here with Tomb Raider 2013. And so it's quite a substantial jump coming from any device with that chipset. Finally, let's talk about the thermals quickly here with the usual 3D Mark Wildlife Extreme stress test. And I hinted earlier that the thermals are quite good here, and right off the bat with the standard performance preset using the quiet fan option, we came in with a 97.1% stability. But let's kick it up a notch, and with the high performance setting using the sport fan option, we came in with a whopping 99.1% stability, which is very impressive. And again, the 8 Gen 2 does very well with active cooling. Now for fun, I ran the test with the standard performance option, but I decided to turn the fan off just to show how much the fan really does help things out here, and in this case we ended up with a 53.6% stability. So kind of like a smartphone that doesn't really have any real thermal considerations behind it. No doubt about it, the fan helps, and honestly, I just have been using it with either the quiet preset or smart mode, which is great for a set it and forget it type of deal. And even to the touch, the temperatures after running the stress tests are solid as well, and really I haven't found there to be much issue with heat when gaming, and the heat is moved away from the device as expected, with the highest temperatures recorded where the chipset is, but where your hands rest, it's much cooler as expected, and definitely what you want to see. Okay, so enough of all these numbers, let's get into the good stuff and check out some actual gaming with the Retroid Pocket 6, since, that's what it was designed to do. Let's start out first with some native Android gaming, and I decided to go with a selection of games that I haven't covered before, at least with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, so we can get an idea of how performance is with these newer releases. The last device I reviewed with the 8 Gen 2 was the Odin 2 Portal, and so there's been some cool games that have come out in the past year or so since then. So outside of Wuthering Waves, which I have on screen here and runs very well using the highest settings available, all of the other games here are new additions to the Play Store. And I always love showcasing new games to check out that are available to play natively with Android. Now, if there are some popular games that you're curious about, there's a good chance I've covered it before with other 8 Gen 2 devices like the entirety of the Odin 2 lineup. If you do have plans to play or load up a lot of native Android games, I would definitely recommend going with the more expensive option since you do get double the storage. The 128GB of internal storage with this unit is pretty limiting nowadays. So Bleach Soul Resonance was one that grabbed my interest when I was going through the mess that is the Google Play Store, and sadly this one does not seem to have native controller support, which is kind of a bummer given that this is an action-based game. But thankfully the tried and true controller mapping tool that is built in works well, and I was easily able to map the controls and get it to work nicely here, and that's the best part about having the dedicated controls on a handheld like the Retroid Pocket 6. This is a fun game that runs very well on the Pocket 6. Where Winds Meet is a game that I've been hearing a lot about, and this is an open-world action RPG that takes place in 10th century China. I haven't delved into this one too much, but it's definitely a beautiful looking game that I thought would be another interesting one to check out here with the Retroid Pocket 6, and I do have the game set to the Ultra FPS and Ultra Graphics quality setting. Unfortunately, this game does seem to have a 45 frames per second cap, which is super annoying when developers hard lock performance based on the device profile, since I do think the 8 Gen 2 can handle beyond that, but otherwise this is running quite well. Now Destiny Rising is a game that I have featured a bit since it released last year, and this is another great game to showcase the power of these devices, and as someone who put several hundred hours into Destiny 2 back in the day, I was definitely curious to see how Destiny Rising would play, and I'd say they nailed it. For whatever reason, Destiny Rising seems to be capped at 50 frames per second, and again I've seen this numerous times with games from the Play Store, where the developer will cap performance based on device profiles. I definitely think the 8 Gen 2 can also handle at least that 60 frames per second target, so I don't really get it. Regardless, I am set here to ultra rendering quality and max frame rate options. Arknights is another new one that I'm featuring here for the channel, and this is a very new game, just releasing earlier this month. Arknights Enfield is an action RPG spin-off of Arknights. This also seems to be a pretty demanding game, and so it's a nice test of performance for the older 8 Gen 2 chipset. I've got Arknights set to use a medium settings so that we can target 60 frames per second, which I think is the ideal target. Now I had this wonky issue with Google Play where the game would occasionally boot me out during gameplay, or even when I was initially downloading the files needed for the game. I restarted the Pocket 6 and it did seem to help resolve the issue, but it had it happen twice, so I'm not entirely sure what's going on there, but it is something to be mindful of. Finally, saving the best for last, and one that is a full-fledged premium game for the Play Store with the port of Red Dead Redemption to Android, which probably doesn't need much of an introduction. Now, I'm glad that Rockstar Games, even though it's super late, at least gives Android fans something of this quality to play, considering that most mobile devices today have more than enough power to handle a game like Red Dead. The best part is that now we don't need to emulate the Switch version or try to run the PC version, and we can just enjoy it natively. I did make a change to allow the game to run at 60 frames per second, since I know the 8 Gen 2 can handle it without issue. And as you can see, the game does run quite well here on the Retroid Pocket 6. Okay, so let's now get into some emulation, and again, this isn't really new territory considering the 8 Gen 2 is very well explored in terms of its capabilities, and we have seen this chipset as far back as the Odin 2 in terms of handhelds. And so for most in the hobby, its power is well documented. It goes without saying that for the most part, gaming up to PS2, Gamecube, Wii, PSP will not be much of an issue for the 8 Gen 2. And while there are always oddball cases like good old Dirge of Cerberus, for the most part you will be able to enjoy the majority of libraries from these consoles and prior generations. I don't want to spend much time here, so just as an example, PSP in many ways can be maxed out to 10 times upscaling, which given that we have a 1080p display is a bit insane. The same goes for a lot of the Gamecube and Wii library, and using Dolphin from the Play Store, I've maxed out a lot of games, including F-Zero GX, which I've shown running here at 6 times the native resolution, which is also nice for those that enjoy using video out with their handhelds. And of course, I can't forget about Kratos and something like God of War 2, which will run here at 4 times the native PlayStation 2 resolution with solid results. Again, something like Dirge of Cerberus is a tough one, and the best performance I've seen with this game on an Android handheld has been the Odin 3, but I did manage to get it running here with some tweaks, but you will still get those frame rate dips, so just keep that in mind. Let's shift gears for a moment and check out a bit more demanding stuff with the 8 Gen 2, but also use this as an opportunity to test out Retroid's dual screen attachment. I have both the Universal and Retroid version for this, and as you can see, the Universal one is just a little too big for the Pocket 6. So you will definitely want to go with the Retroid version if you're interested, or if you already have it, then you're good to go. In the settings, just make sure to go into the handheld settings and then change the display out to the RDS option, which will correct the image output. But it does work quite well with the Pocket 6. Unfortunately, it does obscure part of the power and volume up and down controls, but there is enough of a space that it doesn't seem to press down on the buttons while gaming, so that's definitely a good thing. As you can probably see here, it's actually a pretty neat experience that adds some cool functionality to the Pocket 6. And I've got Wii U running here with the latest version of Cemu, and for me, I always like playing Wii U specific versions of certain games, since they have some interesting features added, like in the case of Shovel Knight with the inventory management, or in the case of Pikmin 3, which was originally designed for the Wii U, and so many really like the Wii U specific features. And both games run pretty well. Now, Cemu for Android is still very much a work in progress, so just keep your expectations in check. But there's a lot to explore here that does surprisingly well. The same goes for 3DS, which does quite well with the 8 Gen 2 chipset, and I'm using Azahar here just to quickly test that functionality with the Retroid attachment, and something like Super Mario 3D Land looks super sharp with this setup, and overall I think for those that might have the attachment, this is a solid setup to play around with dual screen gaming. Now while we are still on the topic of Nintendo platforms, let's jump on over to the Nintendo Switch, and this is an area that the 8 Gen 2 chipset will do very well with. It might not have as much power as the latest and greatest, but it does have the benefit of age, and as such, pretty dang solid compatibility with lots of drivers to use and test with. The same benefit applies to documentation, so if there's an issue with a specific game, there's a good chance someone has documented a way to work around it or a fix for it. At the end of the day, the limitation is really with the emulators themselves, and with time they will become more mature. Since the power is definitely there with the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, and I've managed to enjoy quite a number of games using the Switch's dock mode for up to 1080p gameplay, and you can probably see that I went through a wide range of Switch games to showcase, which gives us a good feel of how performance might look. Switch testing is always an excuse for me to launch Super Mario 3D World, and specifically for Bowser's Fury, which is unique to the Switch version and tons of fun, but it's also absolutely stunning in terms of graphics. There are some games that are a bit heavy on the shader compilation like Bayonetta 3, but overall, while it's definitely pushing the 8 Gen 2 and can be quite demanding, it does run pretty well even while compilation is taking place. And of course, a lot of my favorites to showcase like Crash Team Racing, Nitro Fueled run well here, and outside of this Switch version, there's actually no other way to enjoy this game on Android since it never received a PC port. Finally, at least in terms of consoles, let's check out some PlayStation 3 emulation. And nowadays we have two options that are pretty solid but very much a work in progress on both sides. So again, the lack of maturity with the emulators really means you're going to want to temper your expectations with PS3 on this device, but specifically with the 8 Gen 2, which doesn't have as much overhead like the 8 Elite in the Odin 3. By the way, I have a very in-depth video with RPCSX using the 8 Elite chipset if you are curious about some of the games that are playable over there, but it also might be useful for those curious about games that just work at all and might be worth trying on the Retroid Pocket 6. Let me know down in the comments if you think I should go back and test the 8 Gen 2 with RPCSX or a PS3E. A lot of the usuals that I showcase on the channel, at least in review videos, are what I consider to be lighter or PSN style games, which do alright with the Retroid Pocket 6, so games like Resogun, Joe Danger, and Virtua Fighter 5, which still have some issues, but for the most part, these are typically safe bets when exploring this platform on Android, and at least with the 8 Gen 2. I will say that I had to hop between both a PS3E and RPCSX to maximize my chances for compatibility and playability, which kind of gives you an idea of how things fare overall. Now, speaking of maturity, there is an area for Android gaming that has seen tremendous development and progress in the past year, and that's PC gaming on Android, which has really come a long way. Nowadays, we have tons of options, including Gamehub, Gamehub Lite, Game Native, and of course, Winlator. What's really exciting to me, at least, is that between all of these options, it just means we have a higher chance of getting a PC game to run on one of these Android devices. And I will say the 8 Gen 2, despite its age, is still very capable in this department. In case you missed it, I did an in-depth comparison between the Snapdragon 865, G2, 8 Gen 2, and 8 Elite in a showcase that shows the 8 Gen 2 really holding its own. But also, if you're wanting to see how other games perform outside of this review video, I'd definitely check it out to get ideas for some cool games worth exploring. It's truly amazing though, since it goes without saying that a lot of the indie style games will typically fare quite well, and I'm using Gamehub for all my footage that you are seeing here, but for example, games like Hades 2 and Ori and the Blind Forest all run exceptionally well, and we can even have a bit of fun and try to make use of the 120Hz panel on the Retroid Pocket 6 to really push the frames of these games, which does stay well above 60 frames per second. Now, a game I did show off in that showcase video I mentioned earlier was Final Fantasy VII Remake, which surprisingly works quite well, and for this footage specifically, I am set to a 720p resolution, using a 30 frames per second cap and low settings to help smooth out and stabilize performance. But this game is a really solid performer with the 8 Gen 2. The same goes for Grand Theft Auto 5, which, at least at 720p using just the normal settings, has enough overhead with the 8 Gen 2 to reach above 60 frames per second at times. But the sheer fact that we can play a game like Grand Theft Auto 5 on an Android device is nothing short of amazing. Best of all, we don't need to wait another decade for Rockstar Games to decide they want to port the game over natively to Android, since by then we will probably be playing GTA 6 on our Android devices, thanks to what has been made possible by all of these efforts to get PC gaming running here. Okay, I think we've covered a lot of gameplay, and one last thing I do want to check out is just streaming performance with the Retroid Pocket 6, since we do have Wi-Fi 7 built in, and the device is quite comfortable with a beautiful screen and excellent controls, so I think many will enjoy streaming to this device. Best of all, it's another opportunity to make use of the 120Hz refresh rate, and so we can stream to the Pocket 6 and push 120 frames per second, at least if your PC can handle it. As you can see here, I am using Hades 2 as my tried and true test for this, and we are pushing 120 frames per second to the Pocket 6 from my local PC, using a combination of Artemis and Apollo. And because we have the 8 Gen 2 in the Retroid Pocket 6, we can make use of the ultra low latency feature, which does get us between 2 to 3 milliseconds for the decoding time, which is really solid. The 8 Gen 3 and 8 Elite both fare better here, but really the numbers with the 8 Gen 2 are excellent and amongst some of the best that you will see on an Android device. So, as always, after all this gaming, what can we potentially expect in terms of battery performance with that 6000 mAh battery? Let's start with the lightest test using Yoshi's Island for Super Nintendo, and I have the Retroid Pocket 6 set to a 50% brightness and volume, using the standard performance with the fan, Wi-Fi, RGB lights, and Bluetooth all turned off, with the battery saver on at a 60Hz refresh rate, and it came in pretty strong with almost 19 hours of on-screen time. Now, for something a little more demanding, Kratos is back for the second time in this video, and I have God of War 2 running here at 2.5 times the native PlayStation 2 resolution at 50% brightness and volume, with the Retroid Pocket 6 still using that standard performance setting, but with the quiet fan option, and then Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, and the RGB lights all turned off, and we came in with about 4.5 hours of full speed performance before that extreme Android battery saver kicks in at around 1%. Finally, let's test some docked mode switch with Super Mario Odyssey, and we're still rocking that 50% brightness and volume with the same standard and quiet fan option. But this time I have the Wi-Fi on, Bluetooth off, and the RGB lights turned on to about 50% at a 60Hz refresh rate, and for this one we came in a little over 2.5 hours before the performance absolutely tanks because of that Android battery saving feature at about 1%. The cool thing is that we can see standard performance and the quiet fan option does fare quite well for long-term gaming. And in terms of charging, in 30 minutes, the Retroid Pocket 6 reached about 65%, and it took about 2 hours for a full charge from 0% to 100%, charging initially at a rate of about 26 watts and then slowing down at 80% to help protect the battery. And if you managed to make it this far, we are now at the end of this video, and I think even early on in its life, the Retroid Pocket 6 is looking to be a very real contender this year as a solid option not only for an Android-based handheld, but a great price to performance value with a wonderful combination of great features. The 8 Gen 2 still proves its worth in a handheld device, and with the blend of some really nice refinements from Retroid with their 6th generation mainline device, I think many will be happy with this option. I think it goes without saying that we will be seeing more of this and the 8 Gen 2 in the future on the channel. But until then, as always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.